From the archives of the great library of Arathes, golden city of elves, the wise scholars of Grey Sage present the unlikely and highly questionable accounts from those who were avowed witness. These are the suspenseful investigations of the human, Fraenk Neversleep, Arch Preceptor of Blackroot. And now, the Neversleep Scrolls, Circle of the Mind Thief, written by Philip Walton. The story continues. Chapter 17. Well, if it isn't my favourite counterpart in the Fernbrook district, Fraenk said, taking a casual stance. How's Whisper's fart? That's Arch Preceptor Farathiel Gingerglade to you, an indignant guard with thick arms, spat. His surcoat bore the emblem of Greenbrier, and his head and body were encased in silvery chain. Fraenk guessed this one was kin to the elf he had killed.
Relax, Sir Edward. Let us speak,
Farathiel said, raising his hands and motioning all of them to stand down. The armoured guard set the butts of their spears on the stone, but still looked very much ready to run Fraenk through at the slightest provocation.
I just want a word, Neversleep.
Farathiel approached Fraenk with his hands spread. Well, that's a lot of steel for just speaking a word, Fraenk said wryly. Is there a military demonstration following?
Don't mind them. They insisted on coming along. Somehow they got the idea that you do something unpredictable.
Like kill an elf? Fraenk asked. Turns out that's more trouble than it's worth. I don't recommend it. The Greenbrier man gripped the shaft of his spear so tight, Fraenk could hear the wood creak in protest.
Indeed. So how's Whispers, Neversleep?
Gingerglade asked, without interest. I've been quite busy, I must say. Lots of new friends in the neighbourhood. Some of them are having trouble fitting in, Fraenk replied.
I'm sure you're extending the hospitality that Blackroot is famous for.
All right, Fart. Do you feel like we've exchanged enough pleasantries and we can get to the crux of this visit?
Got somewhere to be?
Gingerglade arched a brow. Fraenk saw the guard contingent standing relaxed, but their eyes were all still locked on him. Well, if we're talking about hospitality, I don't exactly feel welcome here. Why don't you and the boys join me back on my side of the river? I know a place where we can get the best ale.
I didn't come here to beat you up like some common thug, Neversleep. My lord says that the matter is settled, and I agree. I helped broker the truce, even. There is something else I needed to speak with you about, off the rolls.
Some under-the-bridge diplomacy, just like the old days? Fraenk smiled. What is it?
Well,
Farathiel paused.
I need some help tracking down someone whom we believe is in your district.
That's a good one, Fart. You think I'll help you bag a Blackroot district citizen? You really do have rocks in your head.
Oh, no, Fraenk. Nothing so base as kidnapping. We wouldn't even ask about that.
Farathiel laughed. Yeah, you'd just do it, Fraenk thought, but kept it to himself.
One of our senior house servants has gone missing. He is a favourite of Lord Fernbrook's and an absolute wonder. He knows how the Lord likes his meals served and has the Lord's pipe ready on the stroke of the night bell. He is dearly missed.
I suppose he brings the Lord's chamber pot back smelling like rosewater too, Fraenk said.
Yes, exactly.
Farathiel agreed, missing the barb. I don't suppose you could train another servant to replace this one. I hear that's a thing you proper elves do.
Oh, no. Lord Fernbrook likes him in particular, and besides, he's under bond.
Ah, bought and paid for, Fraenk said. I was having trouble imagining anything Fernbrook loved that wasn't gold-coloured and clinked when you dropped it.
Just so.
The other Arch Preceptor's laugh was a bit too forced.
Nevertheless, he does want the servant back. As you suggest, coin is coin, even the one that falls between the stones.
Why do you think he's in my district?
You have the only hovel of kobolds in Arathes.
Farathiel looked directly at him. He seemed to be gauging Frank's reaction. Your missing servant is a kobold. This genuinely caught Fraenk by surprise, and he made no attempt to hide it. Kobolds were half the size of a man, and looked as if a tiny dragon had decided one day to start walking around in human clothes. They were coarse and unhygienic. They could barely be considered civilized, for they started fights at the smallest provocation, and caused no end of trouble for everyone they encountered. One could hardly suggest they were intelligent, and they were barely suited for the dangerous work of climbing between the massive gear teeth of Arathes' great elevator. They certainly were not a creature you'd want serving drinks on a crystal tray in a lord's manor. It was the reason why they were relegated to their own slums in the far corner, outside the city walls.
Oh, yes. They're all the rage in society right now, and it's so hard to find a well-trained one.
Farathiel returned to fidgeting with his pale piglet leather gloves. Right. So you want me to poke my head in and see if he's hiding out there? Because if he spied one of your oafs coming, he'd disappear forever.
I knew you'd get it. They trust you.
They don't trust anyone, and my answer is no, Fraenk replied. But I wish you Shalakar's own luck in finding him. Gingerglade seemed to expect this response.
Don't you want to hear the offer?
I doubt you have anything that I want, Fraenk said. Unless your lord wants to give back the lower market, then I'd bag that kobold myself. Farathiel laughed high and clear. It was a grating sound.
Sorry, Neversleep, that's not on the table,
he said.
But I bet I do have something you want. 3 somethings, to be exact.
Fraenk did not like the way the Arch Preceptor of Fernbrook was now smiling at him. It was the same way he was when they first met. His mind raced as to what this devious elf could have that Fraenk might value so much, that he'd do the dirty work of a Fernbrook. Then it hit him like a warhammer to the chest. The 3 preceptors who didn't check in. "You've got my men!" Fraenk shouted, his fists clenched. Farathiel Gingerglade stamped a foot, and all his guards snapped their spears down to point right at Fraenk. One more step, and they were ready to create a lot of new openings in Frank's body.
They are guests of ours, of course, and free to leave as soon as you return our house servant. Don't play coy, Neversleep. I know that's why you were poking around our district. You won't find them.
Fraenk slipped his hands in his pockets and stepped backward. He didn't want one of these over-eager guards to decide now was a good time to settle the score. "All you want is the kobold?" Fraenk asked.
That's all. Delivered by around this time tomorrow, and you'll even get your guys back alive. You have my word.
Frank's fists tightened in his pocket. Anything to keep them from smashing this elf's smug, perfect face to a bloody ruin. He felt the loop of metal in his fingers go icy cold. "What can you tell me about this kobold, then?" Fraenk growled.
His name is Posu Faljon, and he's...
Then something odd happened. Fraenk heard the Arch Preceptor continue to speak, but his voice became faint and distant. Instead, Fraenk was battered by another voice, loud and disembodied, which also belonged to the elf.
Thief, scum, stole from the master.
There were also flashes of images. They appeared to be from inside Gingerglade's perspective. Lord Fernbrook in a rage, throwing a chest of gems across the room, walking behind a line of servants, sifting through white dust. Then a view of Frank's 3 preceptors standing in the street, unaware that they're being watched. A malicious feeling, like intent on capturing them, as 6 Fernbrook men starting towards them. Fraenk stood blinking. He realized that Farathiel had finished speaking and was just staring at him confused. But at the same time, Fraenk felt the elf's confusion in his own head.
Neversleep, you look a little green. Are you ill?
The Arch Preceptor said with false concern. "A hearty drink will set me right." Fraenk covered quickly and wiped his brow. He noticed on his hand the last few crystals of frost melting to water.
We'll see you tomorrow, then, with the kobold.
You treat my boys well. If I find out you've harmed them, you're going to have something a little sharper than a chest of gems thrown at your head. Farathiel Gingerglade's eyes narrowed, and colour warmed in his cheeks. As if he was embarrassed, Fraenk knew about Lord Fernbrook's tantrum. This was interesting, Fraenk thought, reading the other's reaction. With a swish of his cape, the Arch Preceptor of Fernbrook irritably motioned to his guards to follow. Cautious, Fraenk stepped back to avoid being shouldered off the walkway by the spiteful guards.
Oh, I almost neglected one final thing. I did say I wasn't here to rough you up, but you were trespassing, and we must abide by district rules. I'm sure you understand.
Farathiel, along with 5 of the 6 guards, strode by, giving Fraenk devilish smirks before proceeding up the stairs that led back into their district. "Let me guess who volunteered to give me a reminder," Fraenk said. He turned to see Sir Edward advancing with fists up and already swinging. There are those men who enjoyed a good scrape, a dust-up, a pugilistic repartee, the exchange of knuckles. For what could someone know about themselves without having one's face bashed and giving back in kind? The lesson Fraenk had learned from being in many fights was that it was indeed preferable to be on the winning side of them, and the more one-sided the better. Fraenk was not winning this fight. It wasn't even close. The burly thug was clearly a conditioned fighter. He had Fraenk in weight by a full 3 stone. His reach was several inches further, and he was thick with muscle. He also happened to be wearing a shirt of chainmail, which didn't seem to affect his speed at all. But it certainly did hurt when Fraenk tried to get in a return shot on Sir Edward's body. All of his tactics and training were confoundingly ineffective against this beast. And so, as his own body was receiving brutal new impacts, Fraenk soon began to wonder about time. How long had this beating been going on? When would it stop? If the very nature of time itself was somehow not constant, but could expand and contract relative to the person experiencing it. This last one seemed far less important at the moment. His vision was starting to dim when the tempo and ferocity of the punches diminished. This was good because Frank's body was definitely ready to give out. He couldn't be sure he wasn't hallucinating, but it appeared that a figure had just crept out of the shadows behind Sir Edward. "All right," Fraenk spit blood from a broken lip. "I think we've both had enough, don't you?" Sir Edward breathed and panted, stepping a few paces back. The hood of his mail shirt had slipped down, exposing his sweat-soaked hair and ears that were round, not pointed neither half nor full. "A human!" Fraenk also gasped, more out of pain from aching ribs. "They got us fighting each other." "I wouldn't call what you're doing fighting," Sir Edward replied. "Still, that could have been you that Bass Greenbrier killed, and no one would have fought to avenge your death. They wouldn't even care." This seemed to give the guard pause. The figure behind him crept closer. "House Greenbrier is honourable," he shot back defensively. "House Greenbrier is—" "They're not your house. You're a human, not kin. You're sloss to them. And you're just some jumped-up round-ear who doesn't know his place," Sir Edward said, standing up again and raising his fists. "I tried to reason with you, then you say hurtful things like that." Fraenk shrugged apologetically. "What are you going to do?" Sir Edward laughed. "Not me, but that guy looks like he's going to put you out," Fraenk said, pointing at the man who had just picked up the guard's spear. Sir Edward turned just as the man swung the weapon in a level arc. It splintered into shards as it broke on the side of the guard's head. Sir Edward dropped boneless. Fraenk tried to stand, but a wave of dizziness hit him, and he began to tilt. A strong hand caught his arm and pulled him back upright. Fraenk found himself again looking at a familiar face. "Leos?" "That's the second time I've had to save you, Fraenk," his old acquaintance Leos Muninger said, smiling. "Oh, from him?" Fraenk painfully turned around. The battle rush of the fight was wearing off, and now he just felt completely spent. "He was just giving me directions to Blackroot." Fraenk bent over and turned Sir Edward's head so he wasn't lying face down in the shallow stream that ran in the canal below the bridge. Whatever their differences, Fraenk didn't want the big guy to drown while unconscious. Leos watched and continued to smile placidly. "How about that drink now, Fraenk?" he suggested. "I have to. I need—" Fraenk wobbled, uncoordinated. "Come on now, Fraenk. All of that spy stuff will keep for a few hours. You're not fit to do anything but fall on your head." Leos slung one of Frank's arms over his shoulder. Fraenk let the big man support his weight as they made their way up the far side of the canal and back into Blackroot District. "Thanks, Mudge." Fraenk smiled. "You're a good friend." Thank you for listening. Tune in next week for another exciting episode. And remember, the learned scholars of Greysage caution you that the veracity of these events remains unproven. Now go safe in the light of the powers, until our hands clasp again.